Okay, so new chapter. We'll start off with demand, and we're going to define demand um, as the willingness of a consumer to consume a good or a service. So idea is the desire, the chahat, the basically the willingness of a consumer, obviously, to consume a particular product. And demand can be said to be effective. So effective demand would be when you have the willingness and the ability, sorry, yeah, and the ability to consume the good or service. And ability, by ability we normally mean sufficient income, but that's basically the idea over here. um let's fix this. Yeah. So the next thing that we need to look for, which will help us um show the demand curve graphically, is the law of demand, where the law of demand basically states that price and QD is quantity demanded. So the units a consumer is demanding at a particular price, the amount, the volume the consumer wants, right? A lot of people get confused that what's demand and what is quantity demand. No, there's no such thing as quantity demand. It's just the quantity you are demanding, right? So that's the units at that particular price. Um, so the law of demand states that price and quantity uh, follow an inverse relationship. So the idea here, and I don't know why this is happening. Wait, where did our relationship go? Yeah, here's the relationship. Yeah, so the idea here is that if price, if it increases, the quantity demand should decrease, or if price decreases, quantity demanded should increase. Basically an inverse or a negative relationship, right? We can also call this a negative relationship. And in line with this negative relationship, the demand curve, if you plot with taking price at on your y-axis and quantity on your x-axis, it is downward sloping. Why is it downward sloping? Because that's how the law of demand is fulfilled. If you look at this particular, let's say, price P and quantity and QD, and you, for example, decrease price to P1, quantity demanded would increase to D1. So that kind of follows. A decrease in price leads to an increase in quantity demanded. So you have your negative or inverse relationship, which can only be fulfilled with a downward sloping demand curve. Now, why is the demand curve downward sloping? There are a lot of theories about this, but you don't, while a lot of teachers do teach it, but you don't need to know it per se in AS level. So you look at that in A2 level. So this is all you need to be worried about uh, at this particular point. You define the definitions and the law of demand and how that needs to be fulfilled. So we can now look at some shifts and movements of demand. So let's get to that. All right. So now let's look at factors that affect demand. So on one hand, we have price-related factors. So, or not price-related factors. We have price as a factor. And what this does, it calls an extension or a contraction in demand. By extension, I mean increase in quantity demanded. By contraction, I mean decrease in quantity demanded. So this is basically going to be a movement along the demand curve. And how do we show this graphically? Uh, like very similar to what we did in the previous slide. So you have price, you have quantity, you have your downward sloping demand curve. And let's say this was your initial price, this was, excuse the handwriting, but this was your initial quantity demanded. So if price increases to P1, quantity demanded should decrease to let's say QD1. And what we're trying to show here, if I use a different color, is this particular movement along the demand curve. Since quantity demanded is decreasing, this would be a contraction. However, if price fell, if price falls to P2, let's say, again, if you recall the law of demand, quantity demanded should increase. So we can call this QD to QD2 change an increase. However, if you're when talking about it in terms of demand, we'll call it a movement or an extension. So idea basically that this is a contraction in demand, and this is obviously an extension. And how do you get a contraction? You increase price. How do you get an extension? You decrease price. It's as simple as that. However, what we're going to look at next is more important, and understand, if they just talk about factors affecting demand, you can mention price as a factor because it does affect demand with regards to bringing about extensions and contractions in demand. However, if they ask which factors increase or decrease demand, then you would stick with non-price factors, which we're going to look at now, because this stuff doesn't really increase or decrease demand. It just it might affect it by bringing forth an extension or contraction. So the more important factors here, which you can use irrespective of how they phrase the question, the non-price factors. Now these either increase or decrease demand, as opposed to causing extensions or contractions, and these lead to shifts. So idea here is, if you show graphically, you have price, you have quantity, and if this is your original demand curve, an outward shift to D1 is an increase in demand. However, an inward shift or a leftward shift to, let's say, D2 is a decrease in demand. So same goes with demand, same goes with supply. And a rightward shift is always an increase, a leftward shift is always a decrease. Applies to demand, applies to supply. If you want some logic as to why, very simple, let's just keeping it very simple. If you look at a particular price level P, your initial quantity you were demanding would be Q. If you have a rightward shift, the quantity demanded increases, right, at the same price. So this is not, don't confuse this with the law of demand. That is why price changes. I'm talking at the same price, the rightward demand curve is giving a higher quantity demanded, while the leftward demand curve is giving a lower a smaller quantity demanded. So the idea is, if one curve is giving you greater quantity at the same price, that is obviously an increase in demand. Maybe that helps. But although what you just need to remember is rightward shift is increase, leftward shift is decrease. So what's more important here is to understand the factors, the so-called non-price factors, which we'll get to. Okay, so non-price factors. Let's look at these. The first one is level of disposable income. What is disposable income? You ask. Basically your after tax income, which you basically can save or spend. Those are the only two things you do with your disposable income. So again, we're not talking about indirect taxes. We're talking about direct taxes that directly apply on your income. So stuff like income tax and so forth. So the idea with disposable income is that increased disposable income, I'm just writing DI to make it simple, leads to increased demand, which leads to rightward shift. Rightwards, anyhow, whatever, and vice versa. How do you get increased disposable income through two things? One could be your direct taxes decrease, if direct taxes decrease, your disposable income increases, because your income, whatever it is, if I was taxing, if there was like a 15% in income tax applied on that initially, and I reduced that to 10%, the amount of money you have to save and spend, that is your after tax income, what we call disposable income, that would increase, and hence your demand will increase. So your nominal, your the income that you that you would normally look at, your nominal income might not have been affected at all. However, because the tax rate went down, your real income would increase. Sorry, your disposable income would increase. Use of wrong terminology there. Okay, so that's one thing, and the other thing is your just actual income increases. I mean, if you get a raise, then obviously, uh, if you I mean, like if you get a raise or something, or you go to a better job, then obviously your income itself will increase. And when you have more money to spend, you're much more likely to consume more, to want to consume more units at the same price level or at each and every price level. So you're more likely to demand a product more, which is why your demand increases. So that was point one, which you can explain well. um, Another point that we can look at, and this is a really important one. So prices of related goods, and this one will require some explanation. So let's use red. Let's go here. Yeah. So related goods, we have two goods. We have. Um, Let me just type. My handwriting is horrible. Okay. So when we talk about related goods, we're talking about two types of goods. The first good we're talking about substitutes. And next we're talking about complements or complementary goods. So with substitutes, let me use green. So substitutes are basically, as the name suggests, alternatives. So basically, one particular good can be substituted with another. They're alternatives to each to another. So examples could be, Coke and Pepsi, um, Uber and Kareem, etc., etc. So obviously, some goods are better substitutes than others, and we will study that in XCD, but that's not our concern here. The idea is, if they are to some degree alternatives, we are going to call them substitutes, and that's all we care about here. But what's important is to understand how the price of a substitute, how a price change in a substitute affects the demand of the original product. Understand, we can't talk about the price change of the original product. That doesn't shift the demand. That is leads to a movement in demand. Okay, but let's look at this. So if you have, um, let's say you have the product, and then you have the substitute, and understand, we're only going to have a price change in either the substitute, or as we're going to talk about, the complements, not in the original product, because that won't lead to a shift. Price changes only lead to movements. So if the price increases of the substitute, yes, the quantity demanded would decrease, but we don't really care that much about that, about it here, because we're not looking at the substitute. The idea here, that what we're worried about, is that as the price increases of the substitute, the original product becomes relatively cheap, right? They were both pricing, and now if Uber's price goes up, Kareem now seems cheaper. So because of that, people want to switch to the original product, thus increasing its demand. um, yeah, that is like bad handwriting. Another way to look at this is, if you look at the original, the product, and you look at the substitute. Let's say that in this case, price of substitute decreased. Obviously, its quantity demanded would increase. The law of demand is still at work, but we don't really care that much about that. The idea is, as its price decreases, people would want to consume more of the substitute rather than the original product, because that won't sasta par raha hai, basically. So as people switch, the idea is the demand of the product goes down. Now, what's interesting though is to really look at the price change and the demand change. So if price decreases, demand decreases. In this case, if price increases, demand increases. So idea is you can deduce in the case of substitutes, there is a positive relationship between, or positive or direct relationship between the price of the substitute, this is the price of the substitute, and the demand for the product. That's the idea. So that is something you would have to explain if you get a question about this. The next factor is so next we had to look at complements, and I'll just rub a bit of this because it got slightly messy. Because I don't want to go to a new slide just yet. Okay, so yeah, you still have one example of substitutes where you have a price increase. Anyhow, so complements, by complements these are normally jointly demanded goods. So goods that what do you say, if you want one of them, you want the other one as well. So let me think of an example. So examples could be CDs and CD players, right? Phones and earphones. Okay, not the best of examples, but I think you get the idea. So cars and petrol slash gas, whatever. So idea is if you're demanding one of these, you'd want the other one as well. If you're not, for example, if you're not buying a car in the first place, you probably wouldn't want petrol. But if you're buying a car, if you're consuming a car, or sorry, buying it, then you would want to consume petrol as well, right? They're jointly demanded. If you look here, so if you look here at the, let's take this as the product, as the original product, and then we have the complement. Again, price changes are only going to happen of the complement. If we have price changes of the product, then we just have a movement in demand. So if the price of a complement increases, obviously its quantity demanded would decrease. We don't care about that. Sorry, in fact, in this case, we might care a bit about the quantity demanded. Yeah, so the quantity demanded decreases. This shows that you're consuming less of the complement, right? So for example, if the original product was let's say CD players, but the complement is CD and is CDs, and you're just buying fewer CDs, so you would want fewer CD players as well, right? It especially makes sense in a case where you have to keep purchasing both of it. So let's say if you're buying less of movie tickets, you'll probably be buying less of popcorn as well. That's an idea. That's perhaps a better example. So let's say the complement was like, say, movie tickets, and the original product was popcorn. So if you're buying less, if the quantity demanded of movie tickets goes down, we're obviously consuming less of movie tickets, and hence what our demand for popcorn or whatever the complement is should also decrease. That's the basic idea. Because obviously if you're consuming less of one product, the complement, which is something that goes hand in hand, should be demanded less. So if you look at the other case where the price increases, if the price increases, the quantity demanded, we already looked at an increase. Let's look at a decrease. The quantity demanded increases because I hope you haven't forgotten the law of demand, where price and quantity demanded have an inverse relationship for the same product. Anyhow, if you're consuming less of a particular product, I mean, if you're not buying, if you're consuming more of a particular product, if you're buying more movie tickets, you'll probably be demanding more of popcorn. That's what we're saying. So what one can take away here is that demand and the price of a complement have a negative or an inverse relationship. So, demand and price of the complement, negative relationship. So with substitutes, if you just write this down, so with substitutes, there was a positive relationship between the price of the substitute and the demand for the original product. However, in the cases of, how do you put a positive sign? Yeah, in the cases of complements, you have a negative relationship. And these are two very large factors that you can spend lot of time elaborating on. I'll just write one or two more. So you at the very max you only need three. You never really need more than three, especially when you explain such big factors. But if you go with third one, so advertising or successful advertising. I mean, advertising can either be informative or persuasive. I mean, or both. So if it is informative, more importantly, if it is persuasive, this will definitely lead to demand increasing. If you're advertising, people are more likely to buy it. That's as simple as that. And then you have those exogenous factors. You have taste. You have fashion kya chal raha hai. You have the weather. I mean, if it's a hotter day, if it's a hot day, demand for ice creams, or if it's a hot summer, demand for ice creams is likely to be high. Stuff of that sort. So a lot of the times you get an 8-mark answer, explain the factors affecting demand, and you'd really just explain what demand is, which is what we did in the previous slide, and then you would explain the factors affecting, mainly the non-price factors. Any three of these is, but do include the first two, because the first two are the real chunk, right? The real brunt going to be the real brunt of your answer. Anyhow, so we got all of this. There's just one more thing I want to add in this video. But before I do get to that, so if we look at the first factor that we explained, level of disposable income, and let me just rub everything else and just take this into more detail, because we look at normal and inferior products, and how disposable income increasing really affects demand in more detail and YD. But just to give you a flavor of this now, I initially didn't plan to do so, which is why I didn't mention before, but I think we should. So, my bad. Yeah. So there are two types of products. You have normal products, normal goods, and you have inferior goods. And I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about this, because that's what we're really going to cover in when we talk about elasticities and YAT. But the idea is, normally your normal goods are the higher quality goods, the better goods, right? And inferior goods are like, okay, that's sasta wala, like lower quality, not that good. Understand all of this. This is all about perception, and it's all relative to a person's income. For example, someone might consider a rickshaw to be a normal good and going in a bus an inferior good. Someone might consider going in his own car a normal good and an Uber to be an inferior good. So it really matters depending on your own income level. But idea is, what I stated before, if you have increased income, disposable income, obviously, demand increases. That is true for normal goods. There is a positive relationship between income and demand. And when I say income, I'm talking about disposable income. However, with inferior goods, if you increase disposable income, here demand decreases. Why does it decrease? Because obviously now that you're richer, you can afford to buy the high quality product. You can afford to buy your own car and go in your own car, or rather than going in an Uber, right? You can afford to buy that. I mean, I don't know. Let's say you have two products, one's higher quality, one's not. You can afford to buy the high quality product at the supermarket rather than buying the low quality product. So as you become richer, you demand less of the low quality product or of what you consider to be an inferior good. So demand decreases of inferior good and vice versa. So there's a negative relationship, between income and demand. As income increases, demand decreases. If income goes down, if you're not as rich as you were before, if you're a little poor now, then you're going to demand more of the low quality product, because paise kam hai. That's the basic idea. My bad, I didn't mention this before, but definitely this is something that you not going don't go into great detail, but you can mention when you're addressing a question and explaining how disposable income changes or changes the demand curve. Sorry, affects the demand curve. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about is a very small point where it comes in MCQs. So market demand. Market demand is basically the idea is like for a particular price, you add all the quantity demanded of all consumers. So what we can call this, we can say it's the horizontal summation, basically addition of individual of individual demand curves. What do I mean by this? I mean that if you have the price for a product quantity, and let's say someone's demand curve is this, someone's demand curve is this, so on. And if let's say the market price was this, you have all of these quantities, right? You have, let's say quantity demanded 1, then you have 2, 3, 4, 5. The idea is what your market demand curve would show. It would show at that particular price, whatever price, let's say price P, whatever is going on, the market demand curve would show Q1 plus Q2 plus Q3, and so on, whatever, all the way to Q5. Because the idea is it's not showing at a normal individual demand curve show at a particular price how much quantity demanded exists of a particular consumer. However, the market demand curve shows at a particular price how much quantity demanded of all consumers exists in the market. Do not confuse this with aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shows you it has price level on its y-axis, and it shows you the total demand of all goods and services in the entire economy. This is still micro. This is just talking about the same product. So demand is only about the price and quantity of one product, right? But instead of one consumer, we're just taking into account all of the consumers in the market. But it's still one product. The price of that one product and the quantity demanded in the market of that one product, which makes it different, very, very different from aggregate demand, which talks about the demand for all the products in the economy and so on. And that would be it for demand.